This is The Newsagents.
It's Jon.
It's Lewis, and welcome to our very first live edition of The Newsagents, streaming on Global Player and on YouTube. Never done this before, and you've been sending all of your questions over the last 24 hours or so on the Ukraine crisis, the Trump crisis, Russia crisis. We're going to try and get through all of those today. And also, if you are watching this and you have a question, you haven't already sent one, don't despair, because you can just add it to the comments and we will endeavour to get to them. And of course, my question to start off with, the question that is on the nation's lips, has Jon Sopel still got it? The live broadcasting gene. Has he lost it?
Well, we're going to find out. I mean, you may be able to think that there's a woodpecker in the studio. It's just my knees knocking together at the thought of going live on the news.
You've only done about 2 billion hours of it over the course of your career.
Look, I mean, what a week it has been. And you just think that this time last Friday, Volodymyr Zelensky was waking up in his Washington hotel room and thinking, I wonder how the meeting will go today with President Trump and J.D. Vance. And since that meeting, it has felt that the last kind of 80 plus years of certainty about the Western security umbrella, the transatlantic partnership, NATO, has all been thrown up in the air. And everyone is having to recalibrate what this means for the future. And there's going to be a much more major role for Keir Starmer than probably he ever imagined when he became Prime Minister last July. And for Emmanuel Macron, the French president, these two seem to be driving it. And a week later, we wake up to the news that not only has there been fresh Russian bombing in Ukraine overnight, but that the Eurostar between London and Paris has come to a stop because of a Second World War bomb being found near the Gare du Nord. And you think, oh, what goes around comes around.
How do they find this stuff?
How do they find this stuff?
I don't know. Do they
it's
just
been
like
buried for 80 plus years and someone says, oh, look, down there.
Someone's walking along platform 7 and goes, what the hell's that? It's very, very odd. Well, look, we're going to crack on with these questions. And the first one comes from Lou Green, who has sent this question via Blue Sky. And Lou says this: do you think Starmer has a red line in our relationship with the United States? And if so, what do you think it is? Ukraine-related, Russia tariffs. And this is a really good question because it relates to something that we were talking about on the show yesterday, which is that there is, for good or ill, a marked difference now in the sort of tone and the disposition of Starmer versus his European counterparts, especially Macron and Friedrich Merz, the incoming German Chancellor, who have been much more direct and much more open with their electorates about their thinking on the US relationship, which is to say, in one form or another. I mean, Macron has said that he hopes the US is still there for Europe if push came to shove, but he can't be sure. And Merz has been even more out there on this, basically saying that he no longer thinks the United States is a credible ally, that Elon Musk, who of course has been a key Trump lieutenant, has tried to interfere in his country's election in a way that Russia might have done. Starmer, meanwhile, saying that he believes that Trump and the United States continues to be a reliable ally, and there can be no peace in Europe without them. So the question of red line is an interesting one.
I think that Keir Starmer will not have kind of planned and said, right, this is it. This is the red line. I don't think he'll know it until he gets close to it, or if there becomes a key stumbling block where America is saying no and Britain wants to say yes. Even then, I think it will be the last thing that he would want to do would be to kind of have some kind of break in the US-UK relationship. I somehow think it's not going to be Ukraine-related Russia or tariffs in that way. I think it will be a national security thing. I think if, for example, he feels that Trump is abusing kind of intelligence that's being shared, that's come from GCHQ. It's those things around national security where the wiring is most interconnected, where I think the relationship is probably at its most important. That if he felt that Trump was doing stuff that was actually jeopardizing Britain's national security interests, then that becomes a red line. But I think his whole mindset is there mustn't be a red line. We mustn't reach that point where a red line comes. Now, you're right, Lewis. You listen to Macron, you listen to Merz, and they are clearly thinking that this might happen. It is not yet part of the British mindset that this should come about. I think that Starmer is hoping that Europe steps up and we somehow, in some way, keep America attached to us, to NATO, to the Western security umbrella in a looser form than maybe it's been until now, with Europe playing a much bigger role than it's played until now, but America is still involved. And I don't think the British mindset has yet gone to that place where you say, OK, well, let's start to imagine.
The weird thing is that in reality, the rupture has already come. Not in rhetoric, but in policy. The truth is that what the United Kingdom government is saying about Ukraine is now fundamentally different to what the President of the United States is saying about Ukraine. Certainly in terms of kind of the origin of the war. Basically, Trump basically says this is a sort of plague on both your houses. There's blame to go around on all sides. Obviously, the UK doesn't believe that. But in terms of the kind of prosecution of the war now, what was Starmer saying yesterday at that visit to a defence contractor? He said that it was important to put the Ukrainians in the strongest possible position for the negotiations, which has been the British government position, the European government's position, the United States government position under Biden until 6 weeks ago, right? That is not the position of the United States now. Actually, Donald Trump is actually, either through design or just through effect, putting Ukraine in the worst possible position that it could be for these negotiations, in removing military support, in removing intelligence, in acting in the way that it is to give Russia everything that Russia wants and nothing about what Ukraine wants. So, in effect, that rupture has already taken place. And it may be that that rupture becomes more formalised at the point at which Trump provides or hands down to the Ukrainians a deal. Because if that deal, the thing that I fear most at the moment about what is the point we're going to end up to, is I think Zelensky is being set up for an impossible choice. Yeah. An impossible choice, which basically is between surrender, extortion, and or blame. I.e., that a deal is presented to him that is so one-sided, in order for it to be acceptable for the Russians to stop, that it is so one-sided that he has no choice but to walk away, and then Trump then blames him for it, saying he's not interested in peace. And at that point, Starmer will have to decide whose side is he on in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, look, and thank you all for listening on Global Player and on YouTube. And obviously a lot of important comments coming in already about the subjects we're discussing. I mean, one we've had, Lewis, where do you buy your turtlenecks? Which is a question I hadn't anticipated after
not
your
wearing one today.
Commentary.
My mum's actually just my mum obviously is listening. Hi, Carmen. Actually saying, you need to undo your shirt button, son. It's irritating me. Lol. Love, mum.
Oh, well,
XXX.
yeah, well,
I'll do it for you, shall I? All right, here you go, mum.
There you are.
For the podcast listeners, it's off.
But look,
off.
But going back to the asymmetry of the past week, it has been astonishing and dizzying and head spinning. The pressure that is being put on Ukraine with absolutely no corollary of pressure being put on Russia. Far from it. On the Russia side of it, Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, is talking about halting cyber ops against Russia. They're talking about what sanctions can be lifted against Russia. Whereas it's not just that you're trying to put pressure on Ukraine. This is the thing that really is the most striking bit for me. It is the sense that there is a vindictiveness in what is coming from Washington.
So he hates Zelensky. Trump hates Zelensky.
Exactly.
For personal reasons.
So you hear the stories coming out that America is looking at who could replace Zelensky and talking to the various people. That means that the American administration is getting involved in trying to manage some kind of regime change, it would suggest. You're also talking about denying them the intelligence so that they can protect civilians from Russian missiles coming in. And the night before last, they targeted the hometown of Zelensky.
It's unbelievable.
And you're thinking, no, this is more than just putting pressure on Ukraine to come to the negotiating table, which we understand now that they will do in Saudi Arabia next week, where officials are due to meet, and Mohammed bin Salman is kind of pulling together, US officials and Ukrainian officials for this purpose. It's more than putting pressure on Ukraine. It is trying to punish Ukraine and weaken Ukraine still further.
We've talked so much on the show about the kind of great intellectual schemes which are driving Trump and what he's doing. And as we often say, and sometimes say, you can over-intellectualize it. I mean, some of it genuinely, I'm convinced, is not just animus from Trump about Zelensky and his role in the sort of Hunter Biden stuff, but genuinely I think that Trump does not like the fact that Zelensky is probably one of the only figures in the world who can rival him for column inches and for attention, and he's beloved by so many in the liberal world that he claims to abhor. And I think Trump can't stand it. Debbie in the comments, by the way, said she's got a question. Are we ever going to get to question 2? Which is a great question.
Which is a great question.
But we are, Debbie. This is for you.
Okay, so Gareth Smith has just got in touch with us. Hi, both. My question is around the question of whether Trump is in fact working for Putin. If it can be proven that Trump is a Russian plant, what happens then? Would the GOP, the Republican Party, be strong enough to wrestle back control? Would they impeach him again? Or is Trump just too powerful? Now, one of the fabulous things I saw yesterday was that on X, on Elon Musk's platform, that was Twitter, where he now has this AI tool, Grok.
He looks so bewildered by it, John.
No. Someone questioned whether Trump was compromised. And Grok did the calculation on the basis of all Trump statements and said 75 to 85% probability that Trump has been compromised by Putin. Now, when Elon Musk's own engine is saying it looks like it, I think it's actually not that. I think that it's something more subtle than that, but maybe has the same effect, which is that I think Trump is terrified that Putin does have something on him that is deeply... I can't explain why Donald Trump has never uttered a word of criticism.
It is odd.
About Putin.
Because he has with other... Even, it's often said that he likes autocrats, which is true, but it's never stopped him occasionally, in fact, sometimes vociferously, attacking Xi or others, or like Erdogan or whatever. You know, he's definitely more hostile to his friends than some of America's traditional enemies. But it is unusual the extent to which it never happens with Putin.
He criticises Russia. He never, ever criticises Putin.
Well, not only that, he obviously believed the weirdest... I mean, I maintain that the weirdest part of the very weird afternoon that was the Zelensky-Trump presser, or not even presser, but it's a pool spray, was the bit towards the end where Trump starts talking about Putin as if like they've been in some kind of like shared sacrifice, you know, saying that he too was a victim of the Russia hoax, and that, you know, that was all like part of kind of the design of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, all that kind of thing. You know, talking with genuine kind of solidarity, as if they had both been victims of something. I mean, that was so revealing in terms of how he thinks about it.
But, you know, look, it sounds like a far-fetched question. I mean, I read a novel written by someone who's kind of been involved in diplomacy that he wrote over the summer, where the kind of plot twist at the end is that the Russian president in this fictitious novel had captured the newly elected American president, and that this was the great coup of Russia, and this was how they were going to march onwards. And there are a lot of people who are saying this stuff now because they're trying to find a rational explanation for Donald Trump's behaviour, which seems to be so one-sided. And we had yesterday this weird thing in the White House that, you know, I've got pressure. I've got something on Ukraine, which means they have to, go to the negotiating table, and he sets that up. And then he says, I've got something on Russia as well, but I'm not going to tell you what that is. And you think, what is all this? Why is he so weird in his relationship with Vladimir Putin? I mean, my other theory is that he just looks at Putin as an absolute role model. That everything that Putin has done, he's stayed in the saddle, he's stayed in power, he's ridden out his enemies, he's consolidated power.
And they're ideologically aligned, as we talked about on the show.
Yeah, and they're ideologically aligned.
Yeah.
They're kind of white, heterosexual, anti-woke, anti-gay. Yeah,
and they're against the liberal world order. They believe that might is right, that strength is right, and the poor must suffer what they must, right? And I think, though, I mean, there's a question here saying, well, so what, on the comments? Let's say Putin did have something, so what? Surely no one would care. And what Gareth's question sort of is more alluding to is that if he were, which I agree with you, the idea of him being a sort of Manchurian candidate is just so... It's so... More than anything else, this is often the case, right, with Trump, is that the truth about him can be very distressing, and it leads you to believe and leads you to kind of look away from what might be staring at you in the face. I still don't believe in my heart that is the case. But if he were, I suppose the question is, and what Gareth's question is what would the burden of proof have to be, right, in order for the Republicans or for the American state to remove him? Because it feels like, let's say, I don't know, some taped recording came out between Trump and Putin, which seemed to allude in some way or confirm. Trump would just say, well, you're misunderstanding and more fake news media, all this sort of stuff.
He would say it was a fake video.
He would say it was a fake video, who deny its credibility. I don't know what the burden of proof, and so many of these people on the Republican side, I think this is another difference with the first term, they have gone along with him for so long now They have sacrificed so much of their personal credibility. They have invested so much in him and sacrificed whatever kind of political ethics they had, that they're too far in now. Actually, to accept that he was not only wrong or dangerous, but say a Russian plant from the start, would be for them, given that they've lost so much, the Lindsey Grahams of the world, all of these people who used to be against him, would be so devastating for them politically. All they've got now is Trump's success. So I just don't know. If anyone here is or listening to this is thinking at some point that the Republican Party will stand up to Donald Trump, you just need to look at the history of the last 8 years, and you will see that never happens. It will be a sun that will never rise.
Yeah. Well, look, let's move on to the next question. But before we do, I think we've got a good parallel theme running where we are dealing with the world's most earnest subjects about the future of peace and war in Europe and, our relationship with the superpowers. But we've also got Lewis's clothing. And another good comment has come through, which says, always come for Lewis. Wardrobe choice. And today, it's Father Ted chic.
That's great. I like that.
Yeah, so Father Ted chic for Lewis
There's
Goodall.
something very, very ecumenical about
So
me.
please keep
that
your
would
comment,
be an ecumenical matter.
Please keep your comments coming in on the state of the world and Lewis's wardrobe.
Please do.
Next question.
Anna Winter, eat your heart out.
Yeah, Joshua Abbott. Previously, the idea of there being a minister for men has been derived. The rise of Trump/Tate alongside mental health crisis for men aren't mutually exclusive. Should this be something the government seriously explores?
Minister for Men. I mean, it's very hard to get away from. It's very hard. I think this is one of the problems sometimes. It's sometimes hard to get away with some of these ideas from the people who have proposed them, and over the years, and the sorts of people who propose them, who tend to be from very much one sort of side of politics that is a little bit unsympathetic quite often. I don't think the Minister for Men thing is particularly germane or germane, but I think the male-female split is actually one of the kind of central elements and themes to our politics right now. What is one of the reasons why that the Trump administration, I think, why have they become so expansionist and so interested in the idea of expansion and not playing by the rules? Actually, if you read their stuff, and unfortunately I've spent quite a lot of time reading some of the kind of sort of slightly more fevered kind of essays online by some of the kind of ideological leaders of kind of Trumpism and MAGAism, there is one theme that they come back to again and again and again. And it's this idea that America, that politics, one of the problems with the liberal order is that it's feminine. It's become effeminate, feminized. That one of the reasons why they think that America was so great in, say, not even like the middle of the last century, but the 19th century.
Yeah.
No, I think that the 1950s, I think they were interested in before. I think now they're more interested in the 19th century. I think that Trump is obsessed with William McKinley, a relatively obscure late 19th century president, because there is this idea of that America was great when it had the frontier spirit, and it didn't bother about rules and about kind of norms and conventions. Those are things that rip people off. What they was interested in was expansionism and might, and that was when America was at its best, when it was masculine, in other words. And that is one of the differences, I think, between Trump 2 and Trump 1. This agenda of kind of unbridled masculinity finds its expression in sort of everyday American politics on the hard right now, on the MAGA right. It's something that they are obsessed with.
Look, I remember being in Washington about this time last year and meeting up with Steve Bannon, who is the kind of the ideological outrider for, the Trumpian before Trump.
Yeah.
And him talking about how he thought that following the Supreme Court ruling on abortion that they would lose a lot of women voters, but that they could get that back with Macho Man, with the bro vote, with the towel snapping college boys who kind of liked to be tough and show that they've drunk their protein shakes and all the rest of it. And I think that there is an element of that proved itself in the presidential election in November, where Trump did very well among those sort of people. Now, does he embrace Tate? I mean, it's a really interesting question that, it looks like Tate arrived in Florida and has been run out of town by Ron DeSantis, who, no bleeding heart liberal him. So it's not completely clear that that's the way Trumpism goes. But I've just seen that, there's a bit of there have been 2 Supreme Court rulings that have gone against Trump in recent days. And the kind of one of the swing voters has been Amy Coney Barrett, the last person that Trump appointed to the Supreme Court from his first term. She's picking up the blame. She's going, you were the DEI pick by Donald Trump. Big mistake to have appointed you as a woman. And she's copping it for upholding the laws of the land. And it's just remarkable. They're not turning on the other Republican, the other conservative justice, I should say, who voted with the Liberals on the court. They're turning on Amy Coney Barrett because she's a woman.
I've got some responses here from people watching. Tracy Dawn says, Minister for Men, the world is going mad. KTS says, Minister for Men, have a laugh. Deb says, whoever asked the question on Minister for Men has no idea of his own male privilege. Wow. And I think that, look, there is a danger for the right generally, which is going on a real, I would say is in danger of real ideological overreach on some of these matters. Because what have we seen today? We saw overnight the announcement from Pete Hegseth and the Department of Defense in the US, or rather it wasn't an announcement, I think PA or someone had sort of gone through it. And they found that the department has been going through its archive materials, going through all the sort of promotional things that it puts out. It's beyond parody. And removing images of, women, ethnic minorities and so on, because there's a feeling that this is all too DEI, just to even have sort of pictures of these things that might be promoting people who might not typically be associated with defence. To the point that, and get this, right, to the point that they removed an image of the Enola Gay, the aircraft that delivered one of the atomic bombs on Japan in 1945. Why? Because it had the word gay in the title. And there was a feeling that this had gone. And the suggestion is it might be because there was a feeling this is too DEI. I mean, this is beyond parody, right? This is beyond parody. And I think it starts to look obsessive and it starts to look feverish. And actually at a time, and I think we'll go on to the next question about this, which I think alludes to this or leads into this, actually at a time when the Trump administration is starting to feel the pressure on actually what got it elected. There's a big sort of narrative out there that the DEI stuff, the anti-trans stuff, that's what got it elected. It may have helped at the margins, particularly in making Kamala Harris seem more extreme than she was. But what got it elected was the economy, prices. And when you start, I watched that, as people who listen to the show will know, made a foolish mistake of staying up till 4:00 in the morning to watch the Trump speech the other night. It was more than anything else a kind of celebration and description and litany of all of the things on quote unquote, culture war, abandoning woke, getting rid of woke things that, that he's done over the past 45 days. Fine. Lots of Americans might go along with that. Lots of Republican voters go along with that. But at some point, you start looking like you're fiddling while Rome or Washington burns, in this case, in the sense that you are obsessing about your own weird, quite quixotic interests that still most Americans don't actually care about that much. They continue to care about prices, which are actually getting worse.
There's actually a darker side to some of this stuff as well, which, you were talking about them using an AI program to look at anything that sort of celebrates gay or celebrates women or whatever. I was just reading about what Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, is doing to weed out anyone in America who is a student who's come from abroad and maybe have been a Hamas supporter and was saying, right, well, they're going to have their visas revoked and they're going to be kicked out of the country. And they are using an AI program that is going to search through all their social media posts and all their accounts going back a year or 2 years to see if they have said anything that might be objectionable. Now, okay, fair enough, if that's the way you want to be it. But at the same time, they are badging themselves as this free speech administration that believes in free speech and doesn't believe in people getting cancelled for their viewpoints. Really? Up to a point. Anyway, Lewis, I know you want to go on to the next question. Obviously, we've now got a kind of running theme going, which is to introduce a clothing element between each question. So let me introduce this question to you. Is Lewis wearing a Bitcoin-sponsored jumper?
Or because it says B?
Yeah.
No, I'm wearing this ironically because B is not a grade I ever received at school. So it's actually
because they were all C's and D's?
They were all, I think you know what they were. I didn't look down that side of the ledger, John. Come
Honestly,
on.
He's insufferable. What a man. Go on.
Oliver hates his question. My question to you, is Trump going to cause a recession? The stock markets are going terribly since he came into office. Growth forecasts have been downgraded. Businesses seem worried about the volatility and the tariffs look like they're going to increase inflation. Look forward to hearing your opinions on this. I think this is, as I was just sort of alluding to, I think this is absolutely central, and is something that has the potential to really destabilise the Trump administration. What did we see in the last 24 hours? We saw the absurdity. I mean, and it really was absurd, of Trump having said initially he was going to impose, serious tariffs on various things in Canada and Mexico, then to pause them, then a week or so ago, a few days ago, saying no, they're going to come in what may, then actually cancelling a number of them or postponing a number of them on certain products. And why has he done that? And he claimed that, this is all part of the plan, this is fine. It's not part of the plan. This is Trump making it up as he goes along, because he has been so spooked and so concerned by the stock market reaction that we have seen. This is one thing that we know Trump really cares about. He really understands. He loves stock markets. He loves to see. He did it in his first term. Whenever it went up, he would hail it. And I think that he is spooked and destabilized by the markets, who I think, again, had never seriously believed that he was going to do these tariffs in a comprehensive way or a substantial way. And when it looked like he was going to, have become spooked. There are some analysts now talking about the potential of a recession in the United States, right? And as I say, no obvious signs on what he's going to do about tariffs. He barely mentioned what he's going to do about prices and inflation. He barely mentioned inflation and prices in his speech. Why? In Congress earlier in the week. Why? Because his signature economic policy will make those things worse, will make the price situation worse. And he says, yes, there'll be a bit of trouble, but it's worth it in the long term. You tell that to the average American family in the Midwest or wherever it happens to be, the people who got him elected, very politically problematic for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just yesterday, the US stocks plunged to their worst ever day of 2025. S&P dropped 1.8%, the Nasdaq slid 2.6%. And these are awful, awful numbers for him. And, in about an hour's time, hour and a half's time, we're going to get the US jobs market report, which will tell us how many more jobs have been created in America. And I was reading one report this morning that's saying there may be a contraction, which would be terrible. We've got Jay Powell, the head of the US Federal Reserve, due to make a speech today on the state of the American economy. And again, this outlook is really concerning people. There has been a blizzard of decisions from Donald Trump in these past 6 weeks that he's taken office. But some of the decisions are going in both directions. And it's not just on the economy. It's not just on the folly of the tariff war. There is no way out of this. We have decided it is 25% tariffs on Canada, on Mexico. Oops, no, it's not. We've changed our mind again. Oops, no, they're coming back on again. It's this, we go back to the first question on what is happening in Ukraine. I'm not going to meet Zelensky. I am going to meet Zelensky. It's all gone wrong. Well, it's starting to get back on board again. There is no consistency. And, the traditional thing that you do is you look to central government to be the source of stability for clear indications of what you are doing and the direction of travel of this economy. And all you've had is an example of chaos theory brought to life with the decision making and then the flip-flopping and the contradictions of Trump, not just on this, on Ukraine, on, yesterday we've heard about these kind of going through all the government departments, closing some of them down. Yesterday, Trump apparently telling the heads of departments, no, you're in charge. It's not Elon Musk. You've got to use a scalpel, not a hatchet, to do these things. Everyone is looking both ways at once and nobody knows what's happening. There is chaos, and this is very similar and redolent of the first Trump administration, of nobody knowing what they're quite doing from one moment to the next as Donald Trump changes his mind on a sixpence, or maybe a dime, I should say, on what he should do.
I think, we've talked on the show before. Trump is a master at political communication. I mean, that might sound odd to some people because you might say, well, sometimes you're listening to him and you can't make much sense of what he's saying, and that can be true. But he's a master at dominating the attention economy. He's a master at being on all of our phones, on all of our screens, in all of our newspapers, all of the time. And as a result, what he does very successfully sometimes is he creates his own realities. He creates his own realities that many of his allies and others sort of live in. And he's very good as well, as we saw at the start of the term and before after the election victory. He is good at what economists would call the animal spirits. The animal spirits, the idea, the Keynesian idea that, this is about, that so much of the economy is about sentiment and optimism And there was a great deal of optimism in corporate America in particular. The investment flowing in, the idea that, the new Trump administration, like the last, will be very favourable on taxation, all of these things. It was time to invest in America again. But as a master, as he is, of political communication, in the end, sooner or later, particularly if that communication leads you to certain elements of, say, unreality, that runs out of road. At some point, you clash with reality. You clash with the trade-offs of governing. So, for example, if you put tariffs on goods, fine, yeah, you'll get that revenue. But you'll also look at farms, huge supporters of Donald Trump. But then also suddenly you find that American farmers are having to pay more for so many of the raw materials or agricultural feeds or whatever it happens to be. Defense, he's stopping all these defense contracts with Ukraine. Who's making that stuff?
Yeah.
American arms manufacturers are making that stuff. So with all of these things, sooner or later, there is always in politics trade-offs. And even Donald Trump, as masterful he is at the comms side, can't escape those realities.
Well, you see, I would put it slightly different. Yeah, he's great at communications. But it's one thing being a master of communications and having a strategy for what you're trying to do. Donald Trump's mastery is of staying in the headlines the whole time.
Yes.
And that is what he loves, that everything is revolving around him. And he is the central element of everything. And it's whether it's global news or whether it's domestic news or whether it's how to deal with the fires in California. He has got a view, or what caused the plane crash on the Potomac. One of the kind of acts that marked his first days in office. He wants to be at the centre, at the centre of the wheel, the hub of everything. Well, there are times when it's actually rather better not to be at the centre of every news cycle. And Donald Trump can't discern when it is good news and when it is bad news. There is such a thing as bad publicity. And Donald Trump is attracting a fair bit of it with the endless flip-flopping that has come about over the past few days in the manner in which he has done things. And I think that this is just causing massive turbulence. For example, one of the effects of the tariffs that he introduced was that people were rushing to buy Canadian and Mexican goods that were on the shelves before the prices
went up. The trade deficit in January was the biggest in American history.
Completely.
Because companies were rushing to try and import stuff that they thought they were going to have tariffs. That's what I mean about the trade-off thing. It's inescapable.
So he's boosting foreign business and running down American. Now that is not what he intended. And yet, if you were really consistent and had this is going to be hideous for 6 months, I don't care, because in a year we win. But Donald Trump can't do that.
No, because he hates bad headlines.
He hates a bad headline, so then he turns course again.
And if he keeps doing it, what's going to happen? Tariffs are imposed, inflation goes up.
Yeah.
The Federal Reserve will put up interest rates
at
a time when the rest of the world is decreasing interest rates, lowering rates, and then there will be an almighty clash between Trump and Jay Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, because he thinks that rates should be low. This is what I mean. There are certain things that even Donald Trump, he cannot command reality at all times, as much as he might think he does. David McKecken in Edinburgh has got a question. Maybe he's coming to see our live show on Tuesday.
Well, I hope he is.
I hope you are, David.
I hope he is. David, thank you for your question. And it is a sartorial question, but this one, thankfully, is not about Lewis Goodall. If Zelensky ends up going back to America, but this time with Starmer and Macron, should he wear a suit? Thanks for all your coverage and insights during these turbulent times. David, thank you very much for the question. I wish this wasn't a question that needed to be addressed, because it seems to me so utterly trivial, but somehow it became serious last week. And there's such a fascinating sort of backstory to the way the question got asked, what it says about the Trump White House. It is more than just some snotty-nosed reporter who happened to be in the room, in the Oval Office, who said, why aren't you wearing a suit? The person who asked that question was the boyfriend of Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman who believes in Jewish space lasers and had some advice for one Emily Maitlis of this parish.
Rightly so, man.
Yeah, exactly.
Fine, it's about time someone said
it. And it was just a wind-up, and that was kind of, in a way, that was what set the explosion off. Look, Winston Churchill, when he went and saw FDR and begging for America to get involved in the war, was wearing his war fatigues when he went to the White House.
Yeah, if you even just think about the logic of it for a moment, it's like, what we say, are we seriously saying that maybe if he wore a suit, that he would get the aid and get a better peace deal? the pettiness of that, right? And in fairness to, because I watched the whole thing, in fairness to Trump, he actually said, "Oh, I like his clothes." Like he wasn't that bothered. It was something his little Lord Haw minion was talking about. And actually, there were many dark things and very unfortunate things about that day. If you watch the whole thing, actually, what you realised is that particular question, which, as I say, comes from one of the little like press minions, like you say, John, wasn't even the worst of the toadying that was going on. I mean, there was one guy from, I don't know, kind of Newsmax, US America First, or whatever the hell it's called, little Lord Haw, who at one point said to Trump, he said, Mr. President, this war's been going on for so long, and it went through many of your predecessors. What do you think gives you the moral courage to confront this? And Trump's like, well, that's a great question. I like that a lot. Yeah, I suppose I'm just a peacemaker. And what it shows is again, for this free speech administration, so-called, it has been packing, as you say, John, packing the White House press corps, not with established, respected, legitimate press organizations who are fair and ask fair questions. Of course, there's all this,
and sometimes tough questions.
And tough questions, importantly, which is our job. PA and all this sort of thing, and replace them with these little quizzling organisations, which are not real, and they're just there as extensions of the wider Trump MAGA kind of information ecosystem. And that is a real problem, because you get moments like that. That's what gave it the feeling of a kind of braying pack, of a badger baiting, because it wasn't just Trump, who was actually, again, if you watch the full thing, for most of it, much more moderate. He lost his temper at the end, but actually throughout, there were even moments of levity and so on. But it was Vance and then this pack of so-called members of the press that were really gunning for Zelensky, and that was what was really, really dark about it.
Just going back to Churchill when he visited the White House, I've read this fantastic story, which is that across the road from the White House is now a government house called Blair House, where government leaders, Keir Starmer spent the night there before he met Donald Trump. Apparently the reason that Blair House came about, because I know you love history, was that when Churchill came to the White House, he was wandering around the residence, upstairs in the East Wing, wearing nothing but his cigar. And Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, took exception to this.
I wander around the house at home.
with your Monte Cristo #1 out of your mouth,
yep,
and a Homburg and nothing else.
Yep.
Oh, what a vision. And apparently Eleanor Roosevelt said, we can't have him in the house. We've got to have somewhere else for Mr. Churchill to stay when he's coming to Washington. And thus Blair House came about, and that is the resident. Now, there is another version of history of that, which is nothing to do with that. They found his
story
hours.
Too good to check, isn't it?
Is his story too good to check? That apparently it was the hours he kept and was waking Franklin Roosevelt up at ungodly hours and expecting him to drink brandy and Paul Roger champagne.
I didn't think we'd get to Churchill in the buff on our first
live
show. We can call the podcast that later. Austin David says, I think there will be a mutiny from the American military and security services, and they will overthrow Trump. Am I in cloud cuckoo land? Thing is, Austin, however
in the first term, honestly, in the first term, yeah, I think that it was perfectly possible that you had
it would be so wrong. Whatever
Yes.
Trump. I mean, it would be. You can't. What everyone thinks of Trump and what Trump is doing.
He's the duly elected president of the United States.
He's the commander-in-chief. You cannot even be entertaining the military. I mean, obviously you can imagine a situation, and this is always the case, right, where what would the commander-in-chief have to do for the military to decide not to obey? And obviously you can imagine certain circumstances where, there was speculation. I mean, there was actually preparation made when Nixon was on the point of resignation. There was a lot of worry from the Department of Defense at that time that Nixon might try and do something that was particularly outlandish, or even, use nuclear, whatever it happened to be, to try and keep himself in office, try and manufacture a crisis. And there were very quiet, very secret protocols made, among others with Henry Kissinger involved, who was Secretary of State, thinking about basically sort of starting to quietly remove several powers, including potentially nuclear weapons, from the president if he decided to try and use them. That was, in the 1970s, actually a state apparatus that was working far better than it is today. It's, really, if there were to, it kind of goes back to the kind of like, is he an asset question? If something were to come out which were to show that in some way he were fatally compromised, really it shouldn't be up to the military to do something. It should be up to Congress to impeach him and to convict him, or the cabinet, via the 25th Amendment, to remove him by majority vote, which is also a constitutional provision. The difficulty is it goes back to that question. It is just so hard to see any of those things being invoked. And for the record, I don't think that he's doing anything right now that could possibly, that certainly could justify anything on the military side.
No, I think that's right. The point I was making about the first term is that there were people in positions who could act as a bloc and say, no, Mr. President, I don't think we can do that.
Pete Hegseth is no Jim Mattis.
Pete Hegseth is no Jim Mattis. There is no H.R. McMaster as the National Security Advisor. There is no General John Kelly as the Chief of Staff. They are very, very different people who are running the show now, and that is why Donald Trump is not running into any kind of blocks on any of these sort of things. So I think that is there going to be an overthrow? No. Was there more pushback in the first term? And you going back to the history of Nixon, actually, after January the 6th and the contested election, General Mark Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, reached out
worried about the same thing,
and that China and Russia could get the wrong impression, and held calls to say, don't worry, there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power. We've got this all under control. And Donald Trump has accused Mark Milley of treason, and that he should be tried for treason for having called his Chinese counterparts over this. And the idea that you would say that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who's devoted his whole life to keeping America safe, should be put on trial for treason.
Nartheka, I hope I've said that correctly, maybe Nartheka, has asked on Blue Sky, so many questions, but top of my list, do you think we're heading... God, he's saying this. Do you think we're heading into World War III? And as much as supporting Ukraine is important, should we be allowing Starmer to direct our taxes to the weapons industry rather than looking after our own impoverished people?
Yeah, just before you come to the question, we have a live poll running in the chat at the moment.
Right.
It's not on whether we're at World War III. The question is, would you wear Lewis's jumper? And then, can I just add a supplementary to it? Is it an Armani or Dolce & Gabbana jumper?
I wouldn't like to say, John.
What, because you don't do commercial stuff?
I just don't think they're a bit cheap for me.
Really? Yeah, you get your designers to make them yourself.
They're a little bit passé. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
How's the poll doing?
Well, I don't know, Lewis. We need people to vote on it.
Right,
but,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, on World War III, on the Third World War.
Can I just ask our editor Tom to put me down as a no? I wouldn't wear Lewis's jumper. It's 59% no. Excellent.
59% no.
I think we could get that up to 80%.
I don't go with the crowd, as you know. I'm not a little lemming, John. Anyway, World War III? Are we heading for World War III? Opportunity to get my car keys out, I suppose, if so.
Look, I think that we are in a deeply troubling position in the world right now. I think it is pretty scary, and I think there is huge uncertainty over what emerges from all of this. And we can't know what the shakedown looks like immediately. I don't think so. I don't know so. Because I'm a couple of years older than Lewis, I remember the 1960s and
you
70s.
The 1860s.
Yeah, thank you. And remembering the sense of fear that there was over the potential for a nuclear weapons clash, of the superpowers going to war with each other. And those were real things that you really did think, the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, what could come of that? The Russian invasion, the tanks rolling into Czechoslovakia, other times as well of immense tension in the world where you think, oh my God, this is it. And it doesn't quite come to that. And I just think that, I think we should be prepared. I think that it's probably right that, we are kind of rearming in Europe in a way that we haven't seen in our lifetimes. I think it's inevitable that this happens as a result of the uncertainty that Donald Trump has brought. Do I think we're on the edge of World War III? I don't. I think that's a bit fevered at the moment.
I mean, the scary thing to consider, and various people have suggested this, is that maybe historians will look back and say we're already in it, in the sense that wars always start depending on your perspective. If you ask the Czechs, they would say that the Second World War started in 1938 with the annexation of the Sudetenland. If you ask the Chinese, they say the Second World War started in the early 1930s with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And it's entirely possible in 100 years' time, if after World War III there is anything left of humanity, that historians will look back and say, well, it did actually start in February 2022 with the with the full scale of invasion of Ukraine, or even 2014. So it is possible. Of course, it's possible. I suppose in a way, a third world war entirely, a truly world war, I find harder to credit right now simply because the Trump administration, I find it hard to see how they would actually want to fight Russia. I find scarier is I find it more credible to imagine a wider European war starting, which is you can sort of see how that might emerge, right? Which is that there is a sort of white peace in Ukraine, sort of terms are enforced upon them, terms that they're forced to accept. If Putin thinks that he's got a window of opportunity while Trump is still there, and Trump makes it clearer and clearer, and he continues to be quite ambiguous about it, but there are certain countries he said he would defend. The other day he said he would defend Poland. He really likes Poland, but would he defend France? Well, it depends if the French would defend him. And the Baltic states, he just says, well, they're in a tough neighborhood, and all this stuff. If you can totally imagine a situation in which Putin was to try his luck in the Baltic states, Trump does nothing, but then what about the rest of NATO? It seems to me that if NATO were to mean anything at all, if it were not to be completely hollow Potemkin organisation, the rest of Europe, Britain, France and others, would try and fight that war. And so it's easier, I think, to see a circumstance in which a wider European conflict, whether that is a wider Third World War breaks out, I don't know, but a wider European conflict does envelop the continent.
Do we overestimate? I mean, this is one of the net effects of what Trump has done over these past 6 weeks, is to build up Russia into this kind of huge, scary thing.
Totally.
And, I thought Mitch McConnell, the former Republican Senate Majority Leader, had it absolutely right when he talked about this is the money we're putting into Ukraine is the best investment that America has made in years.
They've been fighting for us.
We have halved the capability of the Russian armed forces and we haven't lost an American life. I mean, what a return on capital that is.
Russia lost 150,000 soldiers last year.
Yeah.
It's astonishing. Their losses are now more combined than the Americans lost in Vietnam, Afghanistan. For every war they've fought virtually since the end of the Second World War. Its economy is on its knees, and the narrative that Ukraine is losing the war. Yeah, it's not been winning the war, and the counteroffensive of 2023 certainly failed. But it's not been losing. It's not been losing. Yeah, it's been losing some territory, but it's been making Russia pay a dear price for every square inch, for every centimetre, every millimetre that they've taken. It's basically been a war in stasis for a long time. That doesn't mean that you would get to the end of it and Ukraine would get everything that it wanted. But I think you're right, John. I think one of the dangers of what we've seen is that, in Trump in agreeing to meet or to send Rubio to meet with Russia, it put them on parity with each other, as if they're the same. They're not the same.
Nowhere near.
Trump is so much more powerful. The United States is so much more powerful. Russia at this point is basically a kind of vassal state to the Chinese economy, and in so many different ways. It's been forced to go to North Korea and Iran, sort of hodgepodge sort of group of weird misfit countries to try and find, military support and so on. But this is what Trump has done. He's managing to enhance and augment Russian power at precisely the point it was weak.
I've got some kind of regrettable news that in terms of votes on the poll,
yes,
it's getting tighter.
Am I going to have to... Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Come on.
Getting tighter. 52% now say...
Oh, it's not 52-48, is it? The dreaded ratio.
Yeah, it's 52% say they wouldn't wear it. But a growing number are coming round to your...
Kath says, shut up about jumpers, John. Lewis is very stylish. There are more important things at the moment. Correct, Kath. Correct analysis. There is time for one final question, which is from Lucy, which I think is such a good one, which is, my question is, will Trumpism die with Trump, or has he become more than an individual and transformed into a lasting political institution?
It's a really tough one. I don't think it doesn't die immediately, because actually, Trump and Trumpism, or MAGA, have got the levers on all the bits of power in the Republican Party. You've had a transplant take place over the last 8 years. If you look at people who control the Republican Party, if you look at people who control the state houses, if you look at people who control the Congress, they are all much more in the shape of Donald Trump and MAGA than ever they were in the first term. And therefore, when Donald Trump goes, the Republican Party isn't going to say, oh, well, we need to go back to a conciliatory Mitt Romney, George W. Bush, Jeb Bush type figure. No. They're going to be saying who is the best person to carry the torch for MAGA? Who will keep the spirit of Donald Trump alive in the next term? I don't see that Trumpism goes anywhere. Maybe some of the chaos of Trumpism that we're witnessing at the moment, the chaotic decision making, the flip-flops, the U-turns, maybe that goes. But I think the general thrust of America first, of economic nationalism, of isolationism, I think that stays in the Republican Party for some time to come.
Yeah, because the Republican Party has been gifted. Trump has been very successful in crafting a new, often winning, although only narrowly, electoral majority for them, right? Or not always an electoral majority, but certainly a winning coalition within the confines of the American system. You know, the party bases in so many ways have flipped. You do not have to go back that far to the Obama victories of 2008 or 12 to see, still the Democrats remaining largely very much a sort of working class party with kind of the, traditional sort of centre left kind of party structure with kind of, sort of more middle class liberals, ethnic minorities as well. And the Republicans still being a real sort of mishmash of kind of historical, that sort of more traditional Republican coalition of particularly richer voters and more educated voters. That's completely inverted over the last 4 cycles or so. And it doesn't seem to me that the Republicans are going to easily want to give that up, not least as they're starting to attract more ethnic minority working class support as well. That said, the question is that inversion, that swapping of the kind of party system, is that something that can be replicated without Trump? Or is it unique to Trump?
Yes.
And certainly what I think is that I don't think that there will be anyone else who is able to exhibit the political strength of Trump in the sense of, Trump continues to be in so many ways, as frustrating as I know many people listening to this might find it, like Teflon. Look what he did the other day when he said about Zelensky being a dictator, and he said, did I say that? There are very few, there are other people who've tried to emulate that style, that sort of bellicose style, that kind of, nothing touches me. And it doesn't work. Look at J.D. Vance this week when he said the thing about, European troops. That damaged Vance. If Trump had said it, it probably wouldn't have damaged him. What I think will outlast Trump, one way or the other, away from the US domestic sphere, is the damage to America's reputation and international alliances. Because America has spent 80 years, I think that the transformation in European strategic position that we're seeing, it took 80 years for America to build these alliances up. It's a bit like your reputation, probably, as we're finding doing this live show. You can spend years and years building up a reputation and it can be gone. It can be exhausted very, very quickly. Because what's the message that America is sending right now? Even if, the Democrats come back in 2028 and you get a more normal president, will Europe be certain that in 2032 that you wouldn't get a more Trump-like figure? You can't build alliances on electoral cycles, on 4-year cycles. That's why Republicans and Democrats alike committed to these alliances for 80 years. So I think that the damage to America, or the changes we're seeing to America in terms of its reputation and the alliance system, I think that will outlast Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, look, it's been fascinating, this. We've now got a final vote. Oh, my God. Would you wear Lewis's jumper? It is. It's the 52-48 vote.
It's the dreaded ratio.
It's the
We have got
dreaded
one
ratio.
final question for you, John, which is...
really?
Sadie says, will John be writing any more books given what's been going on and his experience covering US politics? Strangeland 2.
Strangeland
Even
2.
Strangerland.
Even Strangeland. If only
Strangest
they
land.
didn't speak English, if only they didn't speak any language, I think might be the next book, the final one after all these years. Look, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much for all your questions today on our first live Q&A. Thank you for listening in on Global Player and on YouTube. This will be available as a normal podcast from about 5 o'clock this afternoon, and we will be back on Monday. Should we do it again sometime?
I think we should.
I think so.
I'll just wear a even different jumper next time.
Maybe we could just do it on Lewis's fashion style. I think that would be great. I think everyone would.
Oh no, I hate people talking about
Really,
me.
really, yeah.
I hate that.
Lewis hates nothing
Really does
more
my
than
head in.
people talking about him.
Yeah. I'm
Thank
very
you so
demure.
much for being with us. We'll see you soon. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.